I never thought I'd be the kind of man to sit in a rental car outside his own house in the dark, watching a stranger move through his kitchen like he owned the place. But that's exactly what I did on a Tuesday night in November, parked 2 houses down on Renfrew Street, engine off, hands tight on the steering wheel. My name is Alan Firth. I'm 47 years old. I work pipeline inspection for an energy company out of Edmonton, which means I spend roughly 3 weeks out of every month in places like Fort McMurray, Grande Prairie, and Slave Lake, driving out to remote sites before sunrise and eating dinner in truck stop diners where everybody knows your order by Wednesday. It's not a glamorous life, but the pay is good and I've never minded the solitude. After my wife left, solitude was about all I had anyway. I bought the house on Renfrew in 2019, right after the separation was finalized. A modest 2-story in the Highlands neighborhood. It needed work when I bought it, which I liked. Something to do with my hands on the weeks I was actually home. I repainted the front porch myself, fixed the back fence, put in a proper insulated garage door so the pipes wouldn't freeze. That house was the first thing in years that felt entirely mine. No compromises, no shared opinions on what color the bathroom should be. Just mine. For 3 years, the arrangement worked fine. I'd head out Sunday night or Monday morning, spend weeks on the road, come home to a quiet house, decompress. I had a property management service checking in once a month, a neighbor named Phil, who I trusted to call me if something looked wrong, and a general faith that a locked house in a decent neighborhood was a locked house. That faith lasted until September, when I got a call from my property management contact, a woman I'll call my coordinator, who handled about a dozen properties in my area. She was apologetic in that careful way people are when they think you're going to be angry. I wanted to give you a heads up before you heard it from the utility company, she said. Your gas usage has spiked significantly over the last 2 months. We're talking close to triple your normal consumption for this time of year. I was sitting in a site trailer outside Fort McMurray when she said this, eating a sandwich I'd already decided I didn't want. Triple. In September, when the weather hadn't even turned yet. That doesn't make any sense, I told her. I've barely been home. Maybe 4 days in 2 months. That's what I assumed, she said. And there's something else. The woman across the street, I believe you know her, the one with the red mailbox, she mentioned to me that she'd seen a car in your driveway a few times. Different car each time, she thought. She assumed you had family visiting. I don't have family in Edmonton. My sister lives in Kelowna. My son is at university in Halifax. Nobody should be in that driveway. I finished my shift. I drove back to my motel room and lay on top of the covers for 2 hours staring at the ceiling fan, which is not a cliche so much as it is what you actually do when your brain won't stop cycling through the same possibilities. Someone broke in, someone's squatting, something is wrong with my furnace and I'm about to get a bill that wrecks my budget for the next 6 months. I thought about calling the police right away. I almost did. But I'd been in a situation years back where I'd reported a break-in at a storage unit and the officer had been straightforward with me about how these things go. Without clear evidence of forced entry, without being able to identify what was taken or who did it, there wasn't much they could action. I'd lost tools worth about $3,000 and gotten a report number. That was it. I didn't want a report number. I wanted to understand what was actually happening before I made any move. I also thought about calling Phil. Phil would have noticed something more than a car in the driveway if there was something more to notice. But I didn't want to tip anyone off that I was asking questions, not yet. I drove home 2 days early, on a Thursday. I didn't tell my coordinator. I didn't tell Phil. I arranged to leave my truck at a buddy's acreage east of the city and drove my personal vehicle, a Subaru I kept at his place for exactly these situations. I took a different route into my neighborhood than I normally would, and parked around the corner from my house, not on Renfrew itself. It was just past 10 at night. I sat there for 20 minutes watching. The porch light was on, which it always was, on a timer. Everything looked normal. And then the kitchen light came on. Not the porch, not an exterior light, the kitchen deep inside the house on the main floor. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. My hands went cold and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Someone was in there. In my house. Using my kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, I made myself drive away. I checked into a comfort inn near the Whitemud and spent the night making lists in a notebook. What I didn't know, what I needed to know before I did anything else, The next morning I drove to a Canadian Tire on Calgary Trail and bought 2 wireless indoor cameras and a doorbell camera, the kind that uploads to cloud storage automatically. I also bought a small tablet so I could monitor the feeds remotely. The salesperson was about 22 and very enthusiastic, and I let him explain the features to me twice because I wasn't absorbing anything the first time. I went back to the house around 11 in the morning. I'd watched long enough the night before to know that whoever was inside hadn't been there all night, or at least all the lights had gone off by 2 a.m. and nothing had moved since. I parked a block away and walked, watching. Nothing. I let myself in through the side door, which I kept on a separate deadbolt from the front. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Coffee recently brewed, but not my coffee. I keep a bag of dark roast on the counter. The bag was theirs, but someone had also left a pod machine on my counter that I had never owned. A Keurig, still warm. The second thing I noticed was the dishes. There were 2 mugs in the sink, rinsed but not washed. A plate with toast crumbs. Someone had eaten breakfast in my kitchen that morning and then left. I walked through the house slowly. In the living room, the throw blanket I kept folded over the back of the couch was unfolded and slightly bunched, like someone had used it and tossed it back. The cable remote was on the coffee table instead of the side table where I always left it. Small things. Things you'd only notice if you knew how you'd left them. In the upstairs hallway, there were 2 extra towels hanging on the bathroom door that weren't mine. White, fluffy, the kind you'd buy specifically for guests. My towels were gray. These were white. I stood in the hallway holding one of these towels for probably longer than made sense, just trying to make the information mean something. The spare bedroom was the worst. Someone had put sheets on the bed. I'd left that bed bare, just the mattress, because I never had overnight guests, and it wasn't worth keeping sheets on a bed nobody used. Now there were sheets, a duvet, 2 pillows with pillowcases, a small travel alarm clock on the nightstand, a half-drunk bottle of water. Someone had been sleeping in my spare room, not just passing through. Sleeping there, with their own alarm clock and their own towels and their own pod machine on my counter. I installed the cameras quickly and carefully. One in the living room behind a row of books on the shelf, angled to cover the front door and the staircase. One in the kitchen, tucked up near the cabinets above the fridge. The doorbell camera went up in about 4 minutes. Then I left everything exactly as I found it. I did not touch the towels. I did not remove the Keurig. I drove back to the Comfort Inn and set up the tablet and waited. At 4:40 that afternoon, the doorbell camera sent me an alert. A man walked up my front path with a key in his hand. He was maybe my age, possibly a bit younger. Well-dressed, I thought, not casual, like he was coming from something. Dark jacket, nice shoes. He let himself in like it was nothing, like he had every right to. For the next 3 days, I watched him on the feeds. He arrived in the late afternoon, usually between 4 and 5:30. He used my kitchen, he watched TV in my living room, he slept in the spare room, he left in the morning, sometimes earlies after 9, always in that same jacket. On the second day, a woman arrived. 50s, I thought, short gray hair, carrying a laptop bag and a folder. They sat at my dining room table for about 90 minutes. I could see them through the living room camera if I zoomed in, not perfectly, but enough to see documents spread out on the table. At one point, she turned the laptop toward him and he nodded. The following evening, someone else showed up. Different man, younger, maybe late 20s. He had a rolling suitcase. He stayed one night and left the next morning. A rolling suitcase. That was when I opened my laptop and went to Airbnb and typed in my address. My house was listed as charming Edmonton home, quiet residential neighborhood, all amenities. The photos were of my house, my living room with my furniture, my kitchen with the granite countertop I'd installed myself. The backyard where I'd planted 3 spruce trees after the divorce because I'd needed something to do. The nightly rate was $195. There were 11 reviews. The oldest was dated 8 weeks ago. One reviewer wrote that the host had been very accommodating with early check-in. Another said the neighborhood was lovely and quiet, and they'd slept beautifully. They had slept in my spare room, in my bed linen. With the travel alarm clock and the white towels, I went to the bathroom of the Comfort Inn and ran cold water over my wrists for about 30 seconds, which is something I do when I need to stop my hands from shaking. Then I went back to the table and kept reading. The listing was under a name I didn't recognize. I searched it, LinkedIn profile, Edmonton-based, described himself as a short-term rental consultant and property optimization specialist. His photo matched the man I'd been watching on my cameras for 3 days. I kept digging. I found his website, testimonials. He'd been doing this for at least a year, going by the oldest testimonials, though they were vague enough that I couldn't confirm which properties he'd been operating from. But there was a section on his site that talked about his network of local contacts who helped him identify and manage suitable properties. He used the word network, like this was a legitimate business. The woman with the laptop I identified 2 days later when she came back, and the doorbell camera caught her full face clearly. I ran the image through a reverse search. She had a small business profile on a local directory site, marketing and design services, but there was a secondary listing on the same directory, under the same phone number, for short-term rental photography and listing management. She was the one building the Airbnb profiles, taking the photos, writing the descriptions, managing the reviews. I still didn't know how he'd gotten a key. My house had one lockbox, the kind with a rotating combination, that I used to leave supplies for the property management service when they needed to get in for checks or maintenance. I'd had the same combination for 2 years. The management service knew it. And one other person, the contractor who'd done my furnace inspection the previous spring, a man from a local HVAC company who I'd had to give access to while I was on the road. I'd given him the combination over the phone and never changed it afterward, which I understood now was exactly the kind of gap someone like the man on my cameras would look for. I went back through my own records. The HVAC companies had sent a technician in April. I had no record of who specifically came, just the invoice. But when I looked at the invoice carefully, the technician's name was handwritten in a field that on previous invoices had been typed. Different handwriting, rushed. I called the HVAC company. I asked who'd done my April inspection. There was a pause. The woman I spoke to said she'd have to check their records and call me back. She did call back 20 minutes later and told me the technician assigned to my job had called in sick that day, and the work order had been reassigned internally. The name on the reassignment was a man who'd left the company in June. She seemed uneasy when she said it. I asked her to please make a note of the call. I had enough. I went to Edmonton Police Service the following morning with my tablet, my laptop, a USB drive with all the camera footage, and a printed folder with screenshots and the Airbnb listing and my own annotated timeline of everything observed. The detective I spoke with was a careful, methodical man who read everything twice before he said anything. When he finished, he looked up and said, "How long did you say this had been running?" "The oldest review is 8 weeks, I said, but I think the operation started before they had enough confidence to list publicly. So probably longer." He nodded slowly. "And you believe there's a connection to the HVAC company?" "I believe someone used access to my property through that channel. Whether the company itself is involved, or whether it was an individual acting alone, I don't know." "You did the right thing collecting this before you confronted anyone," he said. "A lot of people in your situation would have walked in and made it a whole other kind of incident." "I know. I'd thought about it. Every time I'd watched that man sit down on my couch and pick up my remote, I'd thought about it. The investigation took 3 weeks. What came out was more organized than I'd imagined and also, in a way, simpler. The man had been running the same operation across 4 properties in Edmonton. He'd identified them all through the same method. Contractors and service workers who, either through carelessness or deliberate cooperation, had shared access information. In my case, the technician who'd come in place of the assigned HVAC worker was someone the man knew personally. They'd grown up together. The technician had passed along the lockbox combination and a rough sense of my schedule based on what he'd seen and heard during the inspection. In exchange, he'd received a flat fee, $1,200 it turned out. That's what my privacy was worth to someone who'd known me for 45 minutes. The woman had handled everything digital: listings, photos, communications with guests, payment processing. She'd set up accounts that were difficult to trace back to real names, but not difficult enough. The detective told me later that the payment trail was what broke the case open most clearly. The police arrested both of them on a Wednesday morning. They were at one of the other properties when it happened, meeting with a guest who'd just arrived for a 3-day stay. The guest was a young couple from Calgary who'd booked what they thought was a normal Airbnb. They were completely innocent. They'd packed hiking gear and were planning to visit Elk Island National Park. The man was charged with breaking and entering, fraud over $5,000, theft, and conspiracy. The woman faced fraud charges and charges related to the financial structure of the operation. The former HVAC technician was charged with breach of trust and fraud as an accessory. The trial was the following spring. I testified for about an hour and a half, walking through the footage and the documentation I'd collected. The defense tried to argue that since there was no forced entry, no broken window, no damaged lock, the charges didn't apply in the way the Crown was framing them. The judge was not persuaded. The man received 22 months in a provincial facility and 4 years probation. The woman received 14 months. The technician, who cooperated fully once it became clear the evidence against him was substantial, received a conditional sentence and 2 years probation. All three were ordered to pay restitution divided among the 5 property owners, including me. My portion covered most of my losses on utilities, the cost of replacing all the locks in the lockbox and the security system I installed after. But sitting in that courtroom, watching those numbers get read out, I kept thinking that none of it was the real cost. The real cost was the 2 months I hadn't known. The guests who'd slept in my spare room, strangers whose names I'd never learn, who'd eaten breakfast in my kitchen and watched TV in my living room and left those white towels hanging on my bathroom door. The weeks I'd been in Fort McMurray or Grande Prairie, not knowing that someone was in Edmonton making money off the life I'd built after everything fell apart. I sold the house 14 months later. I tried to stay. I repainted the front porch again, thinking it might help, like fresh paint could reset something. It didn't. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I thought about the Keurig, about the coffee smell that wasn't mine. Every time I made the bed in the spare room, I thought about the white duvet and the travel alarm clock. I bought a condo in a building with a staffed front desk and a fob entry system and cameras in every common area. I installed my own cameras inside. I have alerts on everything. I check them more than I need to. My son thinks I've gone a bit overboard and told me so during his last visit home. I didn't disagree with him. I just didn't stop. There were 4 other property owners in the case. I only spoke to 2 of them. One was a nurse who worked long shifts and had assumed the occasional disruption in her utility bills was a billing error. The other was a man who traveled for work like I did, who'd come home to find a review online describing the layout of his living room in enough detail to make him feel like he was reading a description of himself. Both of them used the same word when they talked about what it felt like. Invaded. Not robbed. Invaded. That distinction matters. A robbery is someone taking your things. This was someone taking your space, your daily life, the particular arrangement of your furniture, the brand of coffee you keep on the counter, the trees you planted in the backyard on a bad weekend 3 years ago. They didn't just enter without permission. They inhabited. There's a version of this story where I catch the whole thing earlier. If I'd been monitoring my own utility bills more closely, I'd have seen the spike in July, rather than waiting for someone else to notice it in September. If I'd changed the lockbox combination after the HVAC visit, which I should have done as a matter of routine, there'd have been nothing to compromise. If I'd asked Phil across the street to call me specifically if he ever saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway, instead of assuming general neighborly awareness was enough, I might have gotten that call 2 months earlier. I tell people these things now when the subject comes up, which it does occasionally, because the story came out in a local news article after the trial and a few people in my industry circle know about it. Monitor your utilities. Change access codes after every service call. Give a trusted neighbor specific instructions, not general ones. Check your address on rental platforms. It takes 30 seconds and it never occurred to me to do it. If something feels wrong, investigate before you confront, but don't investigate alone. Tell someone what you're doing. Have a record. I still drive out to pipeline sites. I still spend more nights in motels and site trailers than I do in my own bed. I still eat dinner in truck stop diners where the waitress knows what I'm going to order. That part of my life hasn't changed and I don't expect it to. But I check my cameras every morning before I leave the site. I check them at lunch. I check them before I fall asleep. Some nights I scroll through an hour of footage that shows nothing except my living room being empty and quiet, which is exactly what it should be, and I feel something that isn't quite relief but is close to it. My house is my house. I know that now in a way I didn't before. Not because I was naive, I knew what I owned, I knew what I'd worked for. But I know it differently now in the way you only know something after someone has tried to take it from you, and you had to fight carefully and methodically and without losing your head to prove that it was yours. That's not wisdom I wanted, but it's wisdom I have, and I'm not going to let it go to waste.